The smell reached the aid station before the casualties did. It was the smell of Korean winter and copper and something else, something that the corpsman had learned not to name out loud, and it was coming from the back of a truck that had driven 11 miles of frozen road with 4 men in it, 3 of them still alive when it arrived. The date was the 22nd of November 1950, the chosen reservoir. The temperature was 19 degrees below 0 Fahrenheit, and the blood in the truck bed had frozen into a dark lacquer against the steel floor before the vehicle had travelled 2 miles from the contact point. The battalion surgeon, a 26-year-old from Cincinnati named Harold Jian, had been awake for 31 hours. He had already used everything he had. The whole blood, which required refrigeration, which required a cold chain that had collapsed somewhere between Hungnam and the reservoir 3 days earlier, was gone. The plasma was gone. He had saline, he had morphine, he had instruments, and he had the particular focused calm of someone who has accepted that he is going to lose people he should not be losing. What he also had, and what he had not yet used, was a small quantity of something that had arrived with the last supply drop. A sealed tin container, roughly the size of a canteen, marked with a designation most of the men at the station had never seen before. Inside it was a brownish-yellow powder. The powder was reconstituted human serum albumin, freeze-dried and stable at ambient temperature, capable of surviving weeks without refrigeration, and a field environment that would have destroyed every other blood product in the American inventory. You added sterile water, you shook it, you had something that could hold a man's blood pressure while you worked. Jian had been trained on this. He understood what it was and what it was not. It was not whole blood, it was not a complete replacement, it was a bridge and nothing more. But a bridge was what he needed. The first man off the truck had a femoral wound and a pulse that was already becoming difficult to find. Jian opened the tin. What followed in the next 4 hours at that aid station, and what had made German military surgeons, examining captured American medical supplies 2 years earlier in a different war on a different continent, stop and ask their interpreters to read the label again because they were certain something had been mistranslated, begins much earlier than Korea. It begins with a question that military medicine had been failing to answer for over a century. Part 1. The oldest wound. The problem was not bleeding. Bleeding was understood. Tourniquets, pressure, cauterization, armies had managed external hemorrhage since antiquity. The problem was volume, specifically the catastrophic and irreversible collapse of the cardiovascular system that happens when a human body loses more than 30% of its circulating blood volume in a short period of time. Surgeons in the Napoleonic Wars had a name for it. They called it the White Death. A wounded man who had been fully conscious and responsive 20 minutes earlier would suddenly become pale, clammy, confused, and then simply stop responding. His pulse would become rapid and thread-like. His blood pressure, to the extent that surgeons of that era could even measure it, would fall toward nothing, and then he would die. Not from the wound itself, from what the wound had taken out of him. Baron Dominique Jean Leray, Napoleon's chief surgeon and arguably the most capable military physician of his era, understood this as well as anyone alive in the early 19th century. He performed over 200 amputations in a single day at Borodino in 1812. He developed the flying ambulance, the ambulance volante, a horse-drawn vehicle designed to retrieve wounded men from the battlefield while the fighting was still ongoing, rather than waiting until after the engagement ended, as had been universal practice. He understood that time was the enemy, that the gap between wounding and treatment was where men died. But even Leray could not solve the volume problem. He could get a man off the field faster than anyone before him. He could amputate with extraordinary speed. His record for a leg amputation was 4 minutes. What he could not do was replace what the man had lost. At Waterloo in 1815, the British Army suffered 15,000 casualties in a single day. Leray's own estimates, recorded in his surgical memoirs, suggested that a significant fraction of those deaths, perhaps a third or more, were attributable not to the initial wound, but to what we now call hemorrhagic shock. Men who had survivable injuries. Men who died because no one could put back what had come out. For the next 100 years, military surgeons tried everything. Saline infusions, injecting salt water directly into the veins, could buy time, but not much, and the effect was temporary because saline carries no oxygen. Opium to reduce pain and slow the heart rate. Elevation of the legs to push blood toward the vital organs. These were management strategies, not solutions. They were ways of slowing the dying, not stopping it. The First World War changed the scale of the problem without changing the problem itself. The Western Front produced casualties at a rate that made Waterloo look like a skirmish. The Battle of the Somme on its first day, the 1st of July 1916, produced 57,000 British casualties, including 19,000 dead. The field hospitals behind the lines were overwhelmed within hours. Surgeons were operating for 30 and 40 consecutive hours, and the White Death was everywhere. It was in this context that a Canadian physician named Lawrence Bruce Robertson made an observation that would eventually change everything. Robertson, working at a casualty clearing station in France in 1917, began transfusing whole blood from donor to patients directly. Not saline, not any substitute, actual human blood, drawn from a healthy soldier immediately before transfusion and delivered through a rubber tube into the vein of a dying man. The results were, by the standards of the time, astonishing. Robertson published his findings in the British Medical Journal in 1917, describing 11 cases in which direct transfusion had been performed. Of those 11 men, 9 survived wounds that Robertson characterized as almost certainly fatal under conventional treatment. 9 out of 11. Robertson wrote with characteristic understatement that the results appeared to justify the procedure in suitable cases. Here is the key detail. Robertson's method worked. But it required a healthy donor to be physically present, lying next to the patient, connected by a tube, giving blood in real time. In a casualty clearing station behind the lines, this was possible. It was cumbersome and logistically nightmarish, but it was possible. In a field aid station 200 meters from the fighting, it was not possible. And on the battlefield itself, it was not even a coherent concept. The volume problem had a partial solution. The partial solution had a fundamental constraint. And that constraint, the requirement for a living, present donor, would define military medicine's central challenge for the next quarter century. By the time the Second World War began in September of 1939, the British and American medical establishments understood this clearly. They had whole blood transfusion programs. They had blood typing. They had refrigeration protocols. They were, in other words, trying to build a supply chain for something that spoiled in 3 weeks, had to be kept between 1 and 6 degrees Celsius at all times, and could not be transported in any standard military container without breaking down. They were trying to industrialize something that was fundamentally biological, and biology, as several researchers were about to discover, had a solution that none of them had thought to look for. Part 2. The Man with the Centrifuge. Meet Dr. Edwin Joseph Cone. 52 years old in 1943, born in New York City, educated at Amherst College and the University of Chicago with a doctorate in physical chemistry. He had spent most of his professional life at Harvard Medical School, in a laboratory that looked less like a medical facility and more like a chemical engineering plant. Enormous glass vessels, copper tubing, centrifuges the size of refrigerators, temperature-controlled rooms that maintained precise humidity levels around the clock. Cone was not a medical doctor. He was a chemist. And he had spent 20 years studying something that most medical researchers had treated as a single, uniform substance: blood plasma. Plasma is the liquid component of blood. Remove the red blood cells, the white blood cells, and the platelets, and what remains is a pale, yellowish fluid that constitutes roughly 55% of total blood volume. It contains water, salts, proteins, hormones, clotting factors, and antibodies. It is, in other words, extraordinarily complex, and Cohn had spent 2 decades learning exactly how complex. His specific focus was a process called fractionation, the separation of plasma into its individual protein components using a combination of cold temperatures, controlled pH levels, and ethanol, grain alcohol, as a precipitating agent. By adjusting the temperature and alcohol concentration in precise increments, Cohn had learned to make specific proteins fall out of solution in a predictable sequence. Fraction 1 came out first, fraction 2 next, and so on through fraction 5. Stop and think about what this means. Blood plasma is not a single thing. It is dozens of things. And Cohn had developed a method to take it apart and put the pieces in separate containers. The military implications of this were not immediately obvious, even to Cohn himself. But in 1940, as the war in Europe was escalating and the American medical establishment was beginning to think seriously about what a mass casualty conflict would require, the Office of Scientific Research and Development approached Cohn with a question. Could his fractionation process be used to create a plasma product that was stable at room temperature? Stable at room temperature. Those 4 words represented the entire problem. Whole blood had to be refrigerated and used within 3 weeks. Liquid plasma, separated from the red cells but not further processed, had to be refrigerated and used within 30 days. Neither of these timelines was compatible with the realities of forward military medicine, where refrigeration was intermittent, supply chains were chaotic, and a product might sit in a supply depot for months before reaching the man who needed it. Cohn said he would look into it. What he found over the next 18 months was more interesting than anyone had expected. The specific protein he was examining was albumin, Cohn's fraction 5. Albumin constitutes roughly 60% of all the protein in plasma and is primarily responsible for maintaining what physiologists call oncotic pressure, the osmotic force that keeps fluid inside blood vessels rather than leaking into surrounding tissue. When blood volume drops catastrophically, albumin concentration in the remaining blood drops with it, and the oncotic pressure falls, and fluid begins leaking out of the vessels into the tissue spaces, which makes the shock worse in a vicious spiral. Cohn discovered that albumin, when purified through his fractionation process and then subjected to a carefully controlled drying procedure, lyophilization or freeze drying, could be reduced to a stable powder that retained its biological activity essentially indefinitely at room temperature. It did not spoil. It did not require refrigeration. It could be reconstituted simply by adding sterile water, mixing gently, and injecting the resulting solution. A litre of human plasma could be reduced to approximately 30 grams of albumin powder. 30 grams. Fitting easily in a glass vial the size of a man's thumb. That single detail stopped German surgeons cold the moment they understood what they were actually looking at. That 30-gram vial, reconstituted with sterile water and injected intravenously, would expand a patient's circulating blood volume by approximately 500 milliliters within minutes. It would not carry oxygen, it had no red blood cells, no hemoglobin, but it would restore oncotic pressure, pull fluid back into the vascular space, raise blood pressure, and buy enough time for the patient to reach a surgical facility where whole blood transfusion could be completed. It was not a complete solution, it was a bridge, a temporary, field-deployable, room-temperature stable bridge between the moment of wounding and the moment of definitive treatment. Cohn published his initial findings in 1941. The Office of Scientific Research and Development immediately classified the work and began planning industrial production. By 1942, 6 American pharmaceutical companies, including Sharp and Dohme, Armour and Lederle, had been licensed to produce albumin using Cohn's fractionation process. The American Red Cross established a nationwide plasma and albumin collection program. Donors across the country were giving blood, their plasma was being separated, fractionated, freeze-dried, and packaged in small glass vials with a separate vial of sterile water and a set of written instructions that fit on a card the size of a playing field. The scale of production by 1944 was staggering. American pharmaceutical plants were producing albumin at a rate that would have been incomprehensible to Lawrence Bruce Robertson in his casualty clearing station in France in 1917. Hundreds of thousands of doses per month, enough to equip every forward aid station in the European and Pacific theatres simultaneously. But production was only half the problem. The other half was distribution. And distribution depended on something that the Army's medical planners had to figure out almost from scratch. How do you get a temperature-sensitive biological product from a factory in New Jersey to a medic crawling through a hedgerow in Normandy? The answer, it turned out, was simpler than expected, because the product was not temperature-sensitive anymore. That was the entire point. Albumin powder could be packed in any standard military container. It could be stored in a supply depot without refrigeration. It could be issued with a soldier's medical kit. It could sit in a foxhole for 3 months without degrading. And when a medic needed it, he needed 2 things: the vial and water. Clean water, ideally sterile, but in a field emergency, filtered water with a sterilization tablet would do. The procedure was documented in a training film produced by the Army Medical Department in 1943. The film showed a medic opening the kit, combining the powder with the water, inverting the vial several times to mix, attaching the included needle and rubber tubing, finding a vein, and beginning the infusion. Total time from kit opening to infusion beginning, under 8 minutes. 8 minutes, under battlefield conditions, without refrigeration, without a donor, without anything except a vial, water, and a medic who had watched a training film. Перечитай эту строчку еще раз. Because those 8 minutes represent the distance between Raymond Collier dying over the English Channel in February of 1944 and the man in the Normandy hedgerow who lived. That is the distance, not miles, not months. 8 minutes and a 30-gram vial of pale yellow powder. And if this investigation is giving you a clearer picture of what military medicine actually looked like, not the version in the official press releases, but the version that medics were scrawling in their after-action reports and surgeons were noting in their case files when they thought nobody important was reading, then hit the like button. It helps keep this kind of history visible a little longer, and that matters. Part 3. The hedgerow and the vial. June 1944. The hedgerows of Normandy. The bocage. The bocage was not what American military planners had prepared for. They had trained for open field warfare, for the kind of movement they expected after breaking out from the beaches. What they got instead was a landscape of dense earthen embankments, 3 to 5 meters tall, topped with centuries-old root systems and vegetation so thick that a man could be invisible at a distance of 10 meters. The hedgerows divided the Norman countryside into thousands of small, enclosed fields, and each one of those fields was a potential fortress. The fighting in the bocage in July of 1944 was some of the most brutal and intimate of the entire European campaign. Men died at distances of less than 20 meters. Tanks were ambushed from positions that were invisible until the moment the round was fired. Casualties were extraordinarily high. The First Army suffered roughly 10,000 casualties per week during the height of the bocage fighting, and the terrain made evacuation extraordinarily difficult. Meet Private First Class Thomas Aloysius Brennan, 20 years old, from Cranford, New Jersey. Before the war, he had completed 1 semester at Seton Hall University, studying accounting, before enlisting in January of 1943. He was a combat medic attached to the 30th Infantry Division, the old Hickory Division, and by the 2nd week of July, he had already used his entire original allocation of albumin twice and been resupplied once. Brennan kept a personal diary, which survived the war and was donated to the National Archives by his family in 1989. His entries from July of 1944 are sparse. Combat conditions made extended writing impossible, but several entries describe his use of albumin in specific terms. On the 12th of July, he wrote, Abrams hit in the chest and belly by MG. Looked gone. Used the albumin kit on him. Got a vein in his arm after 2 tries. He was talking again in 5 minutes. Talking. Don't know how. Abrams was Private Harold Abrams of Youngstown, Ohio. He reached the field hospital at Vouilly alive. He survived the war. He was 22 years old when Brennan's albumin kit kept him breathing in a Norman hedgerow. Brennan's diary entry is not unique. The medical after-action reports from the Normandy campaign, many of them now declassified and available through the National Archives, contain dozens of similar accounts. Medics describing men who should have been dead surviving long enough to reach surgical care. Surgeons noting patients arriving at field hospitals with blood pressure readings that, given their wound severity, should not have been physiologically possible. One report, filed by Captain David Greenwald of the 32nd Field Hospital in late July of 1944, noted that of 47 patients who arrived with documented hemorrhagic shock and had received albumin in the field, 39 survived to discharge. 39 out of 47, 83%. In a patient population that, under prior war protocols, would have had survival rates closer to 30 or 40%. Stop and think about what that means in human terms, not as a percentage, as people. In the Bocage fighting alone across the 7 weeks of the Normandy campaign, American field medics administered albumin to an estimated 12,000 patients. If the survival improvement documented in Greenwald's report held even approximately, and there is good reason to believe it did, given the consistency of the data across multiple field hospitals, then somewhere between 4,000 and 6,000 men who would have died under prior war protocols survived because of a 30-gram vial of pale yellow powder. 4,000 to 6,000 men, from one campaign, from one theatre, from one product. Now here is what German surgeons were seeing on the other side. German military medicine in 1944 was not primitive. The Wehrmacht had sophisticated surgical protocols, experienced surgeons, and a blood transfusion program that had been operational since 1942. But the German program was built around whole blood and liquid plasma, both of which required refrigeration and had limited shelf life. German forward medical units carried plasma, but it was liquid plasma in glass bottles, requiring a cold chain that the Wehrmacht's deteriorating logistics situation in France made increasingly difficult to maintain. When German medical personnel captured American medical kits in the late summer of 1944 during the fighting around Falaise and in the retreat toward the Seine, they found the albumin vials and did not immediately understand what they were looking at. The product looked nothing like any blood derivative they had encountered. It was a powder, pale yellow, slightly translucent, dry, no refrigeration. No expiration notice that made sense given what they believed blood products required. A German Army medical report from August of 1944, translated and preserved in the United States Army Medical Department's historical collection, described the captured material as follows. American field medical kits contain an unidentified biological preparation in powdered form, packaged with a separate water vial and administration instructions. The preparation appears to be a plasma derivative, but the form is unknown to us. It is unclear by what process a blood product could be rendered stable in this form. The report went on to request that samples be forwarded to military research facilities for analysis. Whether that analysis was ever completed is not documented in the available records. By August of 1944, German military research facilities had considerably more urgent problems. But the confusion is telling. The German medical establishment, professional, experienced, technically sophisticated, had not developed albumin freeze-drying because they had not had Edwin Cohn. They had not had Cohn because they had expelled or driven out a significant fraction of their most capable biochemists in the preceding decade. Many of those biochemists were Jewish. Many of them had emigrated to the United States. Several of them, by 1944, were working in laboratories connected to the very program that produced the powder the German surgeons were holding in their hands and could not identify. The irony is almost too direct to state plainly. almost. But it is there, and it deserves to be said clearly. Part 4. The forensic verdict. The forensic verdict of this investigation is unambiguous. The albumin program was not a single invention. It was a system, a chain of decisions, discoveries, industrial commitments, and logistical innovations that had to work simultaneously and in sequence. Remove any link and the chain breaks. Remove Cohn's 20 years of fractionation research and there is no albumin powder. Remove the Office of Scientific Research and Development's decision to classify and industrialize his findings, and there is no production program. Remove the Red Cross donor network, and there is no raw material. Remove the pharmaceutical licensing agreements with 6 companies, and there is no scale. Remove the training film, and the medics in the hedgerows do not know what the vial is for. Every one of those links had to hold, and they did hold. Not perfectly, nothing in war is perfect, but sufficiently. Let us be precise about what sufficiently means. The United States Army Medical Department's Official History of the Second World War, published in 1966, estimated that albumin administration in the field contributed to a reduction in the case fatality rate for hemorrhagic shock from approximately 47% in the First World War to approximately 4.5% in the Second World War. 47% to 4.5%. That is not an incremental improvement. That is a transformation of the entire category of outcome. Now count what that means. American combat deaths in the Second World War totaled approximately 405,000. The wounded numbered approximately 670,000. Of those wounded, the fraction who experienced significant hemorrhage and shock, the population for whom albumin was directly relevant, has been estimated at between 20 and 30%, or roughly 135,000 to 200,000 men. Apply the difference between a 47% fatality rate and a 4.5% fatality rate to that population. The arithmetic is not comfortable. It suggests that somewhere between 55,000 and 85,000 additional American soldiers survived the Second World War, who would not have survived a conflict fought under First World War medical protocols. 55,000 to 85,000 men alive because of a powder. Now consider the German side of this equation. The Wehrmacht did not have albumin powder. They had liquid plasma, which required refrigeration they increasingly could not provide. They had whole blood programs, which required donors at or near the front lines. They had skilled surgeons, by all accounts. German military surgery at the individual level was excellent. What they did not have was the bridge, the 8-minute, room temperature, field deployable bridge between wounding and definitive care. German case fatality rates for hemorrhagic shock in 1944 are harder to document, precisely because the Wehrmacht's medical records were significantly less systematically preserved than the American records. But the available evidence drawn from German medical reports captured by Allied forces, post-war interviews with German military surgeons, and comparative analysis of wound-to-death ratios suggests that German fatality rates for penetrating torso wounds with hemorrhage remained significantly higher than American rates throughout the campaign in France. This is not a reflection on German surgical skill, it is a reflection on the logistics of biology. You cannot suture a man's blood pressure back up. You can only restore what he has lost, and to restore it, you need something to restore it with, and that something needs to reach him before he dies. And reaching him means being portable and stable and fast. The albumin program was all three. The German equivalent was not. There is a broader observation to make here, and it concerns the relationship between scientific infrastructure and military outcome. Edwin Cohn was not a military man. He had never been in combat. He had never treated a wound. He had spent 20 years in a Harvard laboratory studying the physical chemistry of protein precipitation in cold ethanol solutions. His work was, by any reasonable definition, basic science, the kind of research that produces no immediately obvious application and is justified primarily by intellectual curiosity, and the vague hope that understanding things more precisely is generally useful. The connection between Cohn's laboratory and Thomas Brennan's hedgerow kit was not obvious in advance. It required an institutional structure capable of recognizing the potential application, funding the translation from laboratory to production, organizing the industrial scale-up, and creating the training infrastructure to make the product usable by a 20-year-old from Cranford, New Jersey, who had completed 1 semester of accounting before the war called him away. That institutional structure existed in the United States in 1941 and 1942. It was imperfect, bureaucratic, sometimes slow, and frequently frustrating to the scientists working within it, but it existed. And its existence was not accidental. It was the product of decades of investment in research universities, pharmaceutical industry development, and the specific decision made in June of 1941 to create the Office of Scientific Research and Development under Vannevar Bush, a decision that, in retrospect, may have been one of the most consequential administrative acts of the entire war. The German equivalent of this infrastructure had been systematically degraded since 1933, not because German scientists were less capable, they were not, but because the political environment had driven out or destroyed a significant fraction of the scientific workforce, particularly in chemistry and biochemistry, and had reoriented research priorities toward applications that were immediately military rather than foundationally scientific. The result, by 1944, was a German military that had excellent weapons, experienced soldiers, and skilled surgeons, and did not know what the pale yellow powder in the captured American medical kit was. Now the biographies. Edwin Joseph Cohn continued his research after the war, extending his fractionation work to produce gamma globulin, the antibody fraction of plasma, which became the basis for passive immunization programs against polio, hepatitis, and other diseases. He died in Cambridge, Massachusetts, in October of 1953, at the age of 61 of a stroke. He is buried in Mount Auburn Cemetery. His fractionation method remains, in modified form, the basis for modern plasma protein production. Thomas Aloysius Brennan returned to Cranford, New Jersey, in December of 1945. He completed his accounting degree at Seton Hall, graduating in 1948. He worked as a certified public accountant for 31 years. He never spoke publicly about his wartime service. His diary was found in a shoebox in his attic by his daughter after his death in 2003 at the age of 79. Private Harold Abrams, the man Brennan described in his diary entry of the 12th of July 1944, he was talking again in 5 minutes, returned to Youngstown, Ohio after the war. He worked in the steel industry. He died in 1988 at the age of 66. He outlived the wound by 44 years. And this is where we return to where we started, February 1944. A C-47 over the English Channel, Staff Sergeant Raymond Collier, 23 years old, from Decatur, Illinois, dying of internal hemorrhage in the dark over cold water. The flight medic has done everything he knows how to do. What he does not have is the vial. The vial exists, at that moment, in Edwin Cohn's fractionation protocols, in the license production lines at Sharp and Dome, in the Red Cross collection centers, in the planning documents of the Office of Scientific Research and Development. The science is done, the production is scaling, the training films are being made. But the vial has not reached Collier's aircraft, not yet. It will reach the hedgerows by June. It will reach the medics by July. It will reach the hands of Thomas Brennan in time for Harold Abrams to be talking again in 5 minutes. Collier is 5 months early. This is not a story about triumph. It is not a story about American ingenuity defeating the enemy. It is a story about the distance between knowing a solution and deploying a solution, and what lives in that distance. Raymond Collier lived in that distance. 40 years later, Harold Abrams was still alive because the distance had been closed. The German surgeons who held that vial in the summer of 1944 and could not identify what it was were looking at the distance, closed. They were looking at 20 years of protein chemistry, 6 pharmaceutical companies, a nationwide donor network, a training film, and the institutional decision to fund science before it was useful. They were looking at what happens when a society decides that understanding things precisely is, in the end, a military asset. They did not recognize it, which is perhaps the most precise summary of why they lost. If this investigation gave you something new, not the version that survived in the official histories, but the version that lives in Brennan's diary and Cohn's fractionation papers, and a German medical report asking what the pale yellow powder was, then hit the like button. Subscribe if you want the next chapter. And remember, the distance between knowing and deploying is where the real history lives. It always has been.